The sun had barely risen over the quiet suburban streets of Willow Creek, but I had been awake for hours, scanning the sky for signs of the storm I had tracked all week. Meteorologists had been warning of a fast-moving front, a combination of torrential rain and high winds that could overwhelm the creek running behind the neighborhood. My property sat right on the edge, and I knew better than most what could happen if the water rose unchecked. I dialed the HOA office once, twice, 3 times, leaving increasingly urgent messages about the threat. I sent emails detailing the storm's path, sending screenshots of radar maps and projections of flood risk. Weeks of preparation had gone into ensuring that my own property was secure. But the negligence gnawed at me. What would happen if they ignored so many other warnings in the past? By mid-morning, the first heavy raindrops began to fall. They weren't merely drops, they were bullets from the sky, pounding the streets, flooding gutters, and pushing the creek to the brink. I could see the water rising past my own levee, and I knew time was running out. I grabbed my emergency kit, flashlights, a battery-powered radio, sandbags, and life vests. I pulled on my rain boots, swung my jacket over my shoulders, and headed toward the neighborhood entrance to warn residents directly. The HOA office remained dark and silent, a mocking testament to their disregard. Some of the neighbors noticed me as I trudged through the flooded sidewalks, but even their faces registered more disbelief than fear. "It's just rain," one of them said, trying to shrug off the worry in a futile attempt at courage. But I could see the tension in their eyes. Their yards were already puddles, and the street drains were beginning to sputter and overflow. By noon, the storm had become a relentless wall of water. I watched as debris from upstream branches, trash, even pieces of fencing banged against the creek's edge. The rain hammered on my jacket and splashed into my eyes, but I pressed forward, shouting warnings and knocking on doors wherever I could. Some neighbors reluctantly joined me, moving sandbags and helping lift vulnerable vehicles onto higher ground. Others simply ignored me, trusting blindly that the HOA had somehow planned for this. The truth was far uglier. In their indifference, they had failed to clear storm drains, failed to inspect the levees, failed to alert the community in a timely manner. Their complacency had turned a natural disaster into a looming catastrophe. By mid-afternoon, the water surged over the creek banks, spilling into streets and backyard gardens. Cars floated like tiny rafts, and a few small boats drifted by, caught up in the sudden current. I could hear sirens wailing in the distance, but not from our neighborhood yet. With the rain now a torrential downpour, visibility had dropped to a gray blur. I turned my attention to the Miller family, whose house sat closest to the creek and whose yard had already begun to submerge. They were attempting to move their children and pets upstairs, but the water was rising too fast. I kicked open the side gate and shouted instructions. Sandbags were useless at this point, mere symbolic gestures against the ferocity of nature. I helped them lift furniture and box up essential items, guiding them to the second floor. From the corner of my eye, I saw my own efforts reflected in a few other neighbors who were finally realizing the severity of the situation. Panic was beginning to spread, but without coordination, it was chaotic, unmanageable, and frighteningly close to tragedy. By late afternoon, the flood had fully engulfed the lower parts of the neighborhood. Streets that once had sidewalks and gardens now looked like narrow canals. I had already moved several families to the small hill near the community center, which was elevated enough to remain above water for the moment. The storm raged with a cruel persistence, and I could feel exhaustion creeping into my muscles. My clothes were soaked through, my hands raw from hauling sandbags and dragging children to safety. But there was no time to rest. I radioed the county emergency line, finally getting through after several attempts. The operator confirmed what I already feared. Local rescue crews were en route, but traffic from neighboring areas delayed their arrival. We were on our own for now. As night fell, the floodwaters continued their steady assault. Lightning split the sky in violent streaks, and thunder shook the ground like rolling artillery. From the small hill, we could see the entirety of the submerged streets. The glint of streetlights reflected in the water, the shadows of debris floating past like ghostly ships. Some neighbors panicked, insisting that they would brave the water to reach their homes or vehicles. I had to physically restrain a few, pleading with them to stay put, explaining that one wrong step could mean death. The storm had become a test of endurance and patience, a brutal teacher exposing the consequences of negligence. Around midnight, the first rescue boats arrived, their sirens cutting through the storm's roar. Trained crews navigated the flooded streets, pulling residents from rooftops and vehicles, their movements precise amidst the chaos. I guided them to the families I had gathered, ensuring no one was left behind. Relief washed over me, but it was bittersweet. As the rescue teams worked, I noticed the widespread damage. Yards washed away, fences destroyed, vehicles overturned. The neighborhood that had once prided itself on neat lawns and orderly streets was now a scene of destruction, and all of it could have been mitigated if the HOA had acted responsibly. By dawn, the storm had finally passed. Water still covered much of the streets, but the worst had ended. Rescue crews were now evacuating residents to safer locations, and I finally allowed myself to sit down, dripping and exhausted. I looked around at the community neighbors huddled together, grateful but shaken, recounting the harrowing night. I thought of the HOA offices, dark and silent. Their neglect, a stark contrast to the courage and quick thinking that had saved lives. The emergency had revealed the true character of the community, but it had also exposed the fatal flaw of relying on those who refuse to take responsibility. In the following days, cleanup began. Volunteers and neighbors worked tirelessly, removing debris, drying out homes, and helping each other recover. Insurance claims and repair crews flooded in, but the memory of the storm and the near misses lingered. The HOA finally held a meeting, attempting to explain themselves, but their excuses rang hollow. Residents had seen who truly cared, who acted in the face of danger, and who had abandoned them. Trust had been shattered, and a new understanding had formed. Preparedness and personal responsibility could never be outsourced to an indifferent organization. Weeks later, the creek had receded, leaving behind muddy banks and a scarred landscape. I walked through the neighborhood, checking on families and offering what aid I could. Some had rebuilt partially, others were still struggling. I realized then that the storm had changed us all, not just the physical landscape, but the social fabric of the community. The HOA's failure had been a harsh lesson, but the courage, resilience, and cooperation of the residents had proven that, even in the absence of leadership, people could rise to protect one another. It was a bittersweet victory, hard-earned and deeply felt.